Okay, the recording has started. Like I said, I'm Max. I'm from Pathway CTM. I'm the outreach manager. My job is to go into schools like this, but I normally run sessions about how to write a CV, how to pass an assessment center, how to prep for a one-to-one interview, which is great because that's me with an employer volunteer, and we're looking at something quite specific around careers. Today, we're doing something a little bit different, which are other sessions that we do, which is more about learning about how industries, how your education, what you're learning now can feed into certain industries, and how to look at different types of work and how to get into certain areas. We've been very lucky to be able to work with Sony Music. And like I said, I'm very excited because I've seen the slides already, and they're way more exciting than anything I could have come up with. So I think you guys are in for a treat. Please, as we go through the session today, there is a chat box. We may put information in the chat box. We may ask you some ad hoc questions. Put that in the chat box. And I know that in some rooms, you've got a teacher who's going to have to do the work, but let your students come to the front and type in a question on the Q&A box if they want to. Let your students interact. Even if you need to take a question for them and type it in for them, that Q&A box is there. I will look after it. Questions will come towards the end of the session, but if something is appropriate as we're going through, I will put the question to Ardit and James, who you'll meet in a second. But also, you might have a question in your head before it escapes. Put it in the Q&A box because we'll get to it towards the end, but at least it's there and you've asked the question. I'm hoping we get lots of questions. But yeah, no question is a silly question. There's lots of things that you can ask, and don't be afraid to ask. I have a lot of experience in early careers. I have a lot of experience in CVs, in recruitment, all of those areas. I have no idea about music, so don't ask me any questions about that. There's other people on this call that will do that. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Ardit and James. Welcome to the both of you. Thank you for coming along today. Ardit, how are you?
Yeah, thanks. Amazing. Yeah, really excited to be here, and hopefully it'll be a very good session. We will do our best to be as insightful as possible in this next hour. So just to kick off, I'm Ardit. I work at Sony Music, as you would have gathered already. But just to kick off, I thought it would be really good for us to explain what we actually do at Sony Music, because very aware that not everyone might have an understanding. So Sony Music is a record label. We work with a range of different artists, and our main goal is just to really amplify these artists and to build engaged audiences and fan bases for these artists. Sony Music itself is made up of smaller labels. So we have various different labels that come under Sony Music, whether that's Columbia, RCA, Ministry of Sound, Black Butter, Relentless Records. There's quite a few, and all of them have their own slight different identities. So whether they're focused on specific genres of music, or whether they have specific identities with different verticals, with really being fashion forward, or whatever it might be, all of these different labels have their own kind of speciality. But with that being said, James and I work in Fourth Floor Creative. We are a central division. So we don't actually work in a specific label, but we work with all of the different labels, and we help them with various different tasks. So Fourth Floor Creative is essentially a creative hub made up of various different teams. We've got teams like the brand partnerships team, a design team, a video team, a podcast team, a sync team, as well as an insights and analytics team, which James and I both work in. So I'll let James kind of tee up what we do in the Insight team, but I am very aware that we also set some pre-task for you guys. Hopefully you've had a chance to look at that. Essentially, we were asking you to think about some ideas, imagining you're working on a marketing campaign for Heady One, and we gave you a couple of different audiences. So whilst James is kind of introing what we do and as an Insight team, it would be great if you could just drop a few comments into the chat with any ideas that you did have, or any comments or thoughts that you did have around those ideas, or anything you picked up on those two different audiences that we teed up that you thought were quite interesting. So I'll hand over to James now, who will talk you through the Insight team.
So hello everyone, I'm James. I work in the same team as Ardit, which is the Insight team. As Ardit mentioned, we're part of a central team called Fourth Floor Creative. And ultimately, as the Insight team, we are basically tasked with helping the business understand our artists' audiences. And we try to do that with one purpose in mind, which is to inspire creativity within all the labels that Ardit mentioned, so that we're best reaching those audiences with our artists' music and engaging them in the best way possible. And in this presentation here, I thought that it was worth kind of zooming out and thinking about the changes the industry's undergone, because it's really sort of presented some really new challenges for us as a business. And I think, you know, any business is going through always rapid changes of flux and sort of different challenges. But the music industry specifically has gone through a kind of really, really big change over the last kind of 10 years or so. And everyone internally has had to adapt as a result. And this is just kind of how we as an Insight team have had to adapt. So if you kind of, maybe some of you may relate to this, maybe this is sort of totally alien to how you listen to music, but we essentially as a music company used to be a product-based industry. We used to be looking to sell albums and singles and physical CDs or vinyl to audiences that like those artists. And really the focus of the business was on the ownership of music. So people were buying music specifically from us, and they could obviously add that in a physical way to their own collections at home. And really the landscape in terms of, you know, where our artists were operating was very different. There was far fewer channels to really reach those audiences and sort of communicate about our artists to them. So if you kind of think about how things perhaps used to operate, typically speaking, people would be listening to music on the radio. People would be watching TV more, so they'd be able to see our artists perform in one place, or would be able to kind of put adverts there for our new releases. Perhaps the most passionate fans might be going deeper by reading about our artists or immersing themselves with interviews in magazines. And for really, really big releases, we might even kind of use adverts outdoors to reach people and inform them about our artists' music. But I'm sure, as you probably all appreciate, with kind of the internet thing, all of this entire model has been kind of totally changed. And I think actually all for the better, in that fans now have much more of an ability to lean in. No longer do you have to listen to the radio to catch your favorite music or wait for a performance to come on TV. There are so many different ways to lean in and engage with music and get closer to artists now. So that barrier between the fan and the artist has sort of truly been broken down, and fans are able to lean in much more than they used to. So in that way, potentially it's never been a better time to be a music fan. I'm sure hopefully some of you follow your favorite artists on socials or sort of places where you hang out online and you can engage in music. And obviously, if we kind of rewind 10 years ago, that was just something that wasn't possible. So we really like to think that it's kind of the best possible time to be a music fan. But that has led to a change in the industry for us, and for us as a label kind of working with artists, because we've gone from a mode of consumption that was about a kind of linear sort of purchase journey to what we call an engagement loop. So we've moved from kind of making money for our artists by selling one product, like a CD or a vinyl, for example, and that was the purchase journey, into a mode now where most people engage in music via streaming services. And I'm sure some of you might have subscriptions or use free versions of Spotify or Apple Music or some of the various subscription services out there, or even just using YouTube to listen to music. And that's meant that no longer are we looking at that purchase journey. We are kind of operating in a world where ultimately we're aiming to help our artists engage with their audiences in much more of a long-term way. And we sort of describe that as the engagement loop. And this is something that's come about as we've investigated the way people discover artists. And we've ultimately kind of illustrated what a typical engagement loop might look like for a fan of an artist. So the first moment might be when they discover an artist or they stumble upon a track for the first time. That might be because a friend's shared it with you and you want to check it out. If you like that music they've shared with you or like that artist, then potentially you might move to this investigate phase. So that's maybe where you go a little bit further. You might be on YouTube and look for other tracks by the same artist. You might kind of want to see what they look like and check them out on socials. And if after that point, you're still interested in that artist and their music, this is kind of when we think of fans being in an adopt phase. This is where maybe they're starting to become someone that you're listening to regularly. You're listening to more music by the artist. You're starting to engage more deeply. And then for certain artists, they eventually may well become a total favorite. So the kind of moment you maybe fall in love with their music and they just become the kind of top priority in terms of what you're listening to. And that's obviously our aim as a label, is to get most of our artists at some point to that favorite stage with their fans. Inevitably, over time, we understand that people move on and another artist might come along, or something else might come along that distracts that engagement with our artists. And they might get a bit bored for a minute. Maybe they haven't released anything new. Maybe the music's been listened to a bit too much. It's got a bit stale. So there's inevitably going to be a moment of forgetting. But in this engagement loop, our job as a label is to hopefully make sure that fans of an artist have lots of opportunities to rediscover them, and hopefully go back into this kind of loop where they're spending more time with our artists and their music. So this is the engagement loop, and this is something that the Insight team generated to really help the labels in Sony understand the kind of things they might need to think about when they're looking to engage audiences. So the labels will be working with 4th Floor Creative to create content that really helps people discover an artist. They'll be working with labels to think about what kind of content or what kind of things might someone want to explore when they're investigating an artist. So we'd be creating kind of videos for YouTube or posts for socials that really sort of help people kind of bring them into that artist world. But the reason this has become really important for us as we've moved from a sort of business model that was predicated on selling a physical product to a business that's now thinking more about engagement is that, of course, we compete with other music on streaming services. And of course, our artists compete with the world of other record labels and other artists within that ecosystem. But we also realize, as part of a world of engagement, we compete with so much else for attention as well. Our artists have to compete with TikTok for attention. They have to compete with time you might be spending socializing with friends, time you might be spending kind of playing video games, time on Netflix, time on YouTube. So our artists have a whole heap of things to compete with. And really our role as an Insight team is to really help our labels understand what might be competing for an artist's audience's attention, and how can they sort of best sort of engage in a similar way. So this is why we have artists doing things well beyond the music and in different spaces that isn't just related to releasing tracks. We have an artist called George Ezra that started a podcast. So fans of his can both listen to his music, but then hear much more from George himself via that podcast. We have a collaboration between Labyrinth, Sia and Diplo called LSD, and they released a really, really addictive sort of website that had a kind of game on it for their last campaign that got hours and hours and hours of engagement from their fans playing that game and engaging with the music at the same time. We're lucky enough to work with artists like Beyonce, who released Netflix specials. So kind of meeting her audience that were on Netflix in a space where they already are, with content that kind of really works for her fans in that environment. And artists like Travis Scott that have kind of taken tours into places like Fortnite, where his fans were, and where we can create kind of amazing immersive experiences for both people that are playing Fortnite and Travis Scott's fans at the same time. And then, there's artists that have maybe slightly other interests. Like we have an artist called Ollie Murs, who has essentially started his own YouTube series focused on fitness. So he's not just a musician, he's also kind of, working in the kind of YouTube space and creating kind of content that might resonate with other audiences. And by kind of understanding our artist fans, we are also able to think about different things and different places we can communicate with those fans. So, for example, we know that we sort of found out from our research that a lot of Little Mix fans were engaging with their music via smart speakers like the Amazon Echo devices and Amazon Alexa. And therefore, in order to sort of improve that experience for Little Mix fans, we essentially created an Alexa skill that not only allowed fans to request their music on these kind of devices, but also ask questions to the girls in Little Mix and engage with them on those devices. So those are the kind of things that we've sort of worked on as 4th Floor. But the way we've kind of got to some of those ideas is really by sort of basically helping the business understand what our audiences are interested in. So because of that shift that I spoke about, kind of moving from a purchase journey to engagement loop, understanding how our audiences react to specific pieces of content that we're creating, understanding where our audiences spend their time, is really more important than ever for us as a business. So if you imagine a kind of our artists are on the left side of this sort of diagram here, and the artists want to say the artists want to communicate something via their music. We also need to be thinking more and more as a business about kind of who their audiences might be and what their audiences will be interested in as well, and how we can reach them. And
James?
that's really where, yes.
James, can I ask you a question then? So when you look at this, so I think it's fair to say that the majority of the students that we have in classrooms are of a very different generation to the one that I'm from. I want to ask the teachers if we can do a quick poll of the students in their classroom, and just ask the students and put the number in, how many of them own and listen to music from CDs, and how many of them like listen to Spotify or other streaming services. So just if the teachers can just do a little quick count and then just put CDs and then whatever number, and then streaming services, whatever number. Because I can tell you now, I still listen to a lot of music on CD, and my friends think I'm old, and that I should get over it and move on. But what you were talking about, so nowadays, is it a lot easier to engage with an audience than it was maybe 15, 20 years ago? And does that mean that artists have to work harder? And does that mean that you guys do and have jobs that perhaps didn't really exist 15, 20 years ago?
I think that's exactly it. So, 15, 20 years ago, there was only those few routes, whether that was TV, radio, magazines, billboards out of home to reach audiences. The internet hadn't really kind of changed the business on that front. Now there is a million places that we could be meeting our audiences with our artists and their music. There's different social services popping up every day. All the different touch points that we could use to reach our audiences are expanding exponentially, and that's really where our jobs come into play. Is to really try and do our very best to help understand audiences, to understand where they might be, and how we can best reach them with the music that they might want to listen to.
And then if I'm going to relate that back to the students that we got in classrooms as well, what I want you guys as students, whether you're year 10, whether you're year 12, or whether you're year 13, one of the things that I want you to think about is the world of possibility that exists after school or college, because we're talking to a big company like Sony Music, and it isn't all just about making the music, it's about how you're going to engage with audiences. You can see the stuff that James is explaining now. These jobs perhaps didn't exist as much 10, 15 years ago, so they're new. So there are more opportunities for a younger generation to come through. You will probably understand more about this than I will, but those opportunities are there. So when you look at a company like Sony Music, it isn't just about making music or being an artist. There is so much more work that goes into being successful. And this is where you have to open your mind and see what else is there that goes on. What else can you use those skills for? There's a lot of things that you'll use in the classroom. You're probably thinking, what do I need to know this stuff for? This is where it comes in useful, because there's so many different areas. And I'll just say that I'm having a look at the chat box and the answers. It looks like CDs aren't exactly very popular anymore, but streaming services definitely are popular. A few people who use vinyl, but yeah, definitely a lot more streaming than CDs. So that's interesting to see.
And we totally appreciate that, and that's really what's changed the way we have to think as a business. We think streaming's, it's a great way of engaging with music. There's no doubt about that, but it's meant that we have to change the way we think as a business. But I think that's exciting as well, as you've kind of said. Our team didn't really exist in the company in the format that it is now 5-6 years ago, and there's so many other teams like that within the business. So I think sort of being adaptable and being able to see where there's opportunities emerging is sort of part of being in any industry now, but certainly an industry that's moving as quickly as the music industry. There's always different opportunities and always different sort of spaces that the business is moving in that we can expand into. I think that's what makes it so exciting. So in terms of how we sort of help the business understand audiences, we do that in kind of loads and loads of different ways. And obviously the complexity of understanding lots of different audiences, we've already spoken about there. Max, you said you're still a CD guy. and you still enjoy kind of listening to CDs. Sounds like the vast majority of others on the call and students are streamers through and through, and that's not surprising. But even just in those two kind of spaces there's different audiences that we're going to have to reach and engage with in different ways. And that's a huge maze for us as a company to try and understand. So one of the core ways that we look to help the company understand different types of audiences is by breaking the kind of the UK market down into sort of segments and sort of understanding them as different segments. And to do that, we use something called the Feci code, which is ultimately breaking down the UK population into various groups based on their passion for music. So the kind of red part of this cone here is the fanatics. So they make up less of the population, but they're the most passionate audience about music. Then we move through to the enthusiasts, casuals, and indifferents. So the indifferents are the largest part of the population, and they're the least passionate about music. There's a lot of them, and they tend to be generally older. So this is a kind of audience that perhaps have maybe kind of listened to some oldies, but largely fallen out of love with new music. Whereas if we kind of think about fanatics, they are the most likely to be interested in our new artists. They spend the vast majority of their time engaging with music, and they're kind of much more likely to spend sort of more money on music. So whether that's kind of seeing their favorite artists live or kind of spending more time on streaming services and that kind of thing. So to start making sense of the sort of complexity of the world, we actually took a relatively simple approach and said, let's break down the UK based on these kind of four groups and passion for music. But within that, we reintroduce complexity, and we start to break the kind of market down further. So we then start to sort of create different segments that can help our marketing teams understand audiences based on lots of other different shifts in sort of their consumption. So we look at things like how music mood and how kind of music sort of, the mood that music fulfills influences the artists that people listen to and the way they consume music. We look at things like how age impacts people's passion for music. And you'll see here on this kind of segment map, younger fanatics break down into lots more groups. Whereas if you look over at kind of younger indifference, so at the top of that indifferent pillar, there's barely any young indifference. We kind of realized that most younger people to some degree are engaged with music somewhat heavily. So they may well be casual about music, but certainly it's unlikely that we'll find anyone under 30 that's truly, truly indifferent. So by kind of breaking the market down like this, it really helps give us an understanding of the different audiences we might reach with our artists. And I know as a pre-task, we shared with you some of our kind of segment profiles, and this is what we use with the kind of marketing teams and the different labels, and sometimes even artists to sort of think about the kind of audiences that they want to connect with their music. So for example, here, this is the kind of profile of one of our younger sort of fanatic segments. So we start thinking about the kind of, we include here things like the artists they like, some considerations around how we might reach that audience and how we might engage with them, the kind of media channels that they might be gravitating towards, the kind of streaming services they might be using, kind of brands that they might be engaging with. And if I contrast that to an older, slightly more casual segment, you'll see that some of those kind of things almost totally change. So the media landscape is entirely different for this audience. The kind of artists they enjoy listening to, the kind of brands they connect with are obviously far, far different. But this is something that's really important for us as a label to understand. Otherwise, we stand no chance of reaching with and sort of connecting to these audiences with our artist music. And we're lucky to look after, as Sony, a huge range of artists. So from brand new artists that are incredibly young and just coming through with really kind of innovative new music, right the way through to kind of legends that might have a career spanning 50, 60 years. So because of that breadth of who Sony is and the artists that we work with, obviously really understanding sort of everyone is very important to us. So that's what's kind of led to the segment map here. This is a big part of our role, is kind of creating this understanding of various audiences and working with the teams around Sony to help them get to know those audiences better. So with that, we might do that by kind of going out into the real world. Once we've established these segments, meeting people from those different segments, we might kind of run sessions where we bring audiences into the building at Sony and talk to them and kind of get to know them and get to know the music that they like a bit better. But this is really the sort of foundations of what helps us understand the kind of the UK landscape. And we also use this to sort of think about how we might target different segments at different times. So, for example, generally when we're introducing new artists, we'll be sort of gravitating towards the area highlighted on the segment map now, so that younger fanatic audience. But as an artist sort of campaign moves on, we might be thinking about taking things out to a slightly more mainstream audience. So kind of maybe moving into enthusiasts. We work with artists that already sit within a casual audience. And really our objective as a label is just continuing to reach that same audience with their releases. We might work with artists that want to, have slightly sort of change in their career and maybe are creating different music and want to sort of appeal to a different part of the market and the different part of their audiences. And that could be anything from kind of moving from enthusiasts about music into a more fanatic lane, or for certain artists, it could even be moving from kind of the real mainstream and then to do something a bit more credible, geared towards fanatics. So all of the time we're talking to our artists about what they want to achieve and using this as a bit of a foundation to help us. And just as one quick example before I wrap up, we've worked with an artist called Tom Walker for many, many years now. And this is just a kind of quick rundown of how we worked with his label Relentless on their campaign. We started off in the early days, really sort of focused on that sort of fanatic audience. So releasing lots of EPs and really kind of sort of credible pieces of content that showcased how amazing Tom's voice is and how amazing and unique his guitar playing is, and his songwriting credibility to that fanatic audience. But as his sort of career progressed, lots of different opportunities arose. So one of his tracks called Leave a Light On was used quite predominantly within lots of kind of adverts and lots of in the background of lots of TV programs. And that really helped sort of break Tom Walker outside of just that fanatic audience that liked him purely for his music and introduced him to a much more casual audience or enthusiast audience as well. As his career progressed, he sort of collaborated with others as well. So kind of collaborating with Rudimental took him out to that kind of slightly more casual audience that wouldn't necessarily have heard about him without those kind of collaborations. And then as we went to release Tom's first album, he was kind of lucky enough to win the Brits Best Newcomer Award. And once he had kind of won that award, but obviously through the hard work of building those foundations within those lots of different audiences, that really sort of cemented Tom as someone that resonated with quite a sort of vast swathe of the population. So that gives you an idea of how we use some of this information to inform what we're doing and how we're working with the labels. So I hope that all made sense and gives you a bit of an idea of what Ardit and myself spend our time doing. We're happy to, I can't actually see any questions at the moment, but happy to field any questions, or Ardit, I don't know if you wanted to revisit the task that we kind of set in advance of this as well.
Before we do, sorry, Ardit, to interrupt. There is a question, and Josh has asked, let me just click on it so everybody can see it. So how do you reach new and upcoming artists? Do they come to you or do you find them through research?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I think the answer is there's a variety of different ways. I think there's loads of, I think one thing that James really pointed out was streaming has unlocked so many opportunities for artists. There's so many new ways for audiences to find the artists that they enjoy. And that also means there's loads more artists, which is a great thing. In terms of how to discover them, I think it really varies. I think one thing that, is always really important is the music. So you can't really get away from that, but also, looking at things like social media and looking at things like specific platforms, whether it be, music on TikTok or, someone who has a really great presence on YouTube or has a really clear brand on Instagram. I think socials have become really important in understanding artists. The way that you find them, you can use analytics tools, you can use people that you're interested, you can use just your own ways of finding them in terms of just real manual research. This is an actual job in itself. So the department that takes care of that is called A&R. and there'll be A&Rs in every single label. So whether it's Columbia, Ministry of Sound, or Black Butter, and they'll have their own ways of finding artists. But there's a variety of different ways that that can happen.
Interesting. There are a few other questions. Somebody's asked, how does marketing and royalties work for the artist?
Do you want me to take that, James, or did you want to?
Yeah, I mean, again, I think I'm happy to give it a kind of an initial answer. Really, it honestly varies artist to artist. You know, we'll be working with artists to understand how they want to communicate with their audiences, and that will inform the marketing as well. So obviously, we've got really kind of specialist marketing teams that can help with that. As an insight team, we help sort of bring the audience to life, so to understand where they might be and how we can market to them. But honestly, it kind of varies artist to artist based on their objectives as well and how they want to communicate about their releases. And really, as a label, we're just here to amplify that. And then in terms of royalties, again, that will really sort of adapt artist to artist. So it depends kind of what the artist is releasing as well. We might, with some artists, we just sign them for one single and they've just got kind of one song that they might want to release through Sony. And then there's other artists where we've worked with them for the entirety of their career. And as you can probably sense from this presentation, things have adapted and changed so much over the course of perhaps a 50-year career. So, you know, we've probably worked with artists like Bob Dylan for a 50-year career. Obviously, things have changed so much over that time that those kind of royalties will adapt, and the way they're kind of remunerated will change as well over that time.
Thank you.
Sweet. I can maybe just revisit the pre-task slightly, because I know there are a couple of people that have dropped some ideas into the chat.
Absolutely.
So I think Lee dropped an idea around a giveaway with 5 PS5s with a unique design related to Hetty's Edna album cover, having access to Instagram, and, you know, making 5 unique consoles would probably feed into the interest of hype makers. I think just picking up on that, I think what's really great that you've already done is you've started to think about the audience, right? You've started to think about, one, the footy and PlayStation audience, because you're kind of thinking about PlayStation, but you're also thinking about how to make it appealing to a hype maker audience. And I think this is a really important part of idea generation, but also idea prioritization. As you can imagine, there are loads of cool ideas that might be generated for a marketing campaign, but sometimes you can't do all of them, and you need to figure out which are the best ones to do, and actually rooting it in, well, what does the audience want? What is the audience going to relate to? What are they going to enjoy? It's a really useful tool that we can use to help make sure that the ideas that we're pushing are ones that the fans are actually going to enjoy, beyond just being a really cool idea that we think is quite interesting. So that's a really good observation that you've already made there. I think there was another one. So can't see who this is from, but for the Feci and PlayStation group, the suggestion is to use Heady One's music for the launch of a new video game. Again, that really feeds into what James was saying about kind of the attention economy, the idea that there's loads of different things going on that's fighting for your attention, and actually combining with some of them is really useful. So gaming is a huge one, and I think any collaborations that can happen between music and gaming are ones that we're definitely interested in and trying to push. And then you have the hype makers audience, and the idea here is because they don't like adverts being pushed in their face, we thought they could have discrete adverts on SoundCloud, or he could have a partnership with JD where they promote his work on billboards for their products. Furthermore, he can have a virtual concert through his own app. All of those are great ideas, right? Because you're thinking about maybe brand partnerships. So what audiences, you can maybe imagine that an audience of JD Sports is also going to be an audience of Heady One. So actually combining the two is going to be really useful. And as I mentioned earlier, we also have a brand partnerships team in 4-Floor Creative that will be working on all of these types of ideas. And often what they'll do is they'll come to us and ask us, wait, is JD's audience the same as Heady One's? Do we know that for sure? And then we can use the data that we have to say, yeah, it is. And that can make them actually have a stronger pitch or a stronger kind of partnership with JD, because we now know that we're talking to one specific audience. So again, all of those ideas, it's great because now we're thinking about it from an audience perspective. And I think that's a really nice way to think of ideas, and one that we as a team definitely try to prioritize.
And I think the other thing that we feel as an insight team is by sort of helping the business be as passionate about our audiences and our fan bases as they are about our artists. It just means that we've got kind of extra ammunition to come up with great ideas. So with those kind of profiles that we shared, there's a starting point to generate ideas that are hopefully more sort of, you know, resonant for the audiences. But that's such a better place to start than just a blank piece of paper or kind of a blank sort of computer trying to kind of generate ideas from nothing. So that's really the aim of kind of what we're there to help the business do.
I think we've also got a couple more that are just coming in, so I'll just continue going through them because I think they're really useful. So one of these ideas is having pop-up shops for Edna's deluxe album. Hetty is also a big fan of Manu, so you could have a cross theme of Manu and music. Again, really thinking about those collaborations. And this is a really nice one because you're working with what the artist also enjoys. As much as the audience is important, obviously the artist is really important as well. So anything that can kind of tie the two, super important. And then another idea we have here is to advertise the Feci and PlayStation. Advertise this track with Stormzy. If they're already a fan of Stormzy, they may listen to that song and add it to a playlist. And if they really enjoy it, they're more likely to check out the rest of his discography. So that's a really interesting point, actually, understanding what other artists' target audiences might be into. And what we do quite a lot of is something we call audience profiling. So essentially trying to understand the audience of an artist, but understand what else they're into. So whether it's different artists, whether it's the brands they're into, the media they're into, what are they watching on TV, what social platforms are they using. So really understanding all of these different things helps us as a team really provide some rich insight so that when we come up with these ideas, we're coming up with ideas that we think will be really good. Cool. So I think that's it from the ideas. Obviously, feel free to continue dropping some in. I know that we have 20 minutes left, so I wonder if it's useful for us to maybe just go into a few questions and we can kind of answer those and talk a bit about that. We're also very happy to talk a bit about kind of our journeys. But I think, we definitely want to answer your questions and make sure they're all answered. And then we can kind of talk briefly about our journeys of getting into the music industry, and we're very happy to answer any questions about that as well.
We've got with that, we've got a good question. Do you think record labels were hesitant to use streaming services in the beginning because it generates less money? Tough one, huh?
James, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, I can take that one. I think any industry can often be slightly trepidatious or wary of the unknown, and I think probably the music industry as a whole, not just Sony, was at a point where things were changing very quickly, and they probably were unsure about kind of different models of consumption and how they're going to work. So I definitely think that played a role, but I think the industry has learned a huge amount from that sort of turbulent period in time, and has become way more interested in sort of jumping sort of both feet into different opportunities and different ways of reaching audiences. So I certainly think those early days of streaming were a bit of a rocky time, because obviously no company is able to make decisions quite as clearly as maybe they would like to when there's quite a lot of money that was being made, not being made. But I think the streaming landscape has changed so much, and now it's become such a dominant sort of listening format that we're actually really lucky enough to be in a really growing industry now. And artists are lucky enough, generally to be making good money via streaming, but also being able to reach a huge audience via streaming services that then they can kind of play to live, kind of sell other merch to, and kind of reach in different ways as well. So yeah, I think to answer your question, definitely at the time it was a tumultuous time, but I think the industry's learned a lot from it, which I think is probably the more important thing.
That's good. That's interesting to hear, actually. because yeah, I do remember when streaming services started, and I'm still not massively into it because I'm not that great with it, but that's just my age, I think, more than anything. We've got another couple of great questions, and specifically around apprenticeships, and I think Heather is on the call, who might be best placed to answer this one. And the question is, do you offer any apprenticeships at Sony, and is there any way we can get any experience, and is there any qualifications we need to get a job or experience at Sony Music? And then with that, and I don't know if this can also be you, Heather, there is another question that says, what are some ways to go about networking with people and breaking into the industry after studies? Well, coming along to a session like this is a great start, and asking a question like that is also a great start, because then if you ever meet somebody later on in the company, you can reference back to this session. Might even be Heather that you meet later on. But Heather, how can we answer those questions?
So the first one, so yeah, apprenticeships are great ways to get into any industry if you don't want to go to university or, you know, go down that route. Unfortunately though, Sony don't offer apprenticeships. So we have an internship scheme, which is slightly different. It's 12 months long, and you know, it's essentially like a full-time internship. So there's no like studies alongside it. But for something like insight, I guess initially at the entry level, and James, correct me if I'm wrong, you wouldn't necessarily need music experience to come into an insight team at a junior level. So there probably is a lot of companies out there that offer apprenticeships in that specific area. And I think in terms of qualifications, if you are going to go down the university route, you're probably looking at any kind of degrees or subjects where there's a lot of research involved, and you're looking at data and kind of pulling the insight out of that data. So you know, anything like economics, I suppose, or even some of the arts degrees and stuff like that. So I'll let Audit and James like add to that if there's anything. But just the other thing, yeah, about the networking and people breaking into the industry. So to your point, Max, exactly, like attending stuff like this and connecting with us in the aftermath of it. So like people in music, like we all know how hard it is to get into. We've all been on that journey, banging on the door, trying to get in. So I think people are very generous with their time in terms of like, you know, having a virtual coffee with you or kind of answering questions or whatever it may be. So there's a lot of networks, like I follow so many on Instagram where they offer like free advice sessions and free career sessions. Me and Audit did another one a couple of weeks ago where we essentially did the same thing and kind of talked through like career journeys and offered advice. So start to follow those kind of organizations on socials and really engage with them and go along to those free events, and then just reach out to people after. You know, people are usually easy to find on LinkedIn or either just like direct message on socials as well. So yeah, I hope that answered those questions.
I mean, yeah, I think that did. Those are great answers as well. And there's lots of useful information put in there as well to take away as a student to think about your future, because this doesn't just apply to the music industry. This applies to a lot of industries, and that advice about networking, reaching out. When you're trying to get into an industry that is tough to get into, or into a sector that is tough to get into, you will find that the people that are in know that, and they're more than likely willing to help you get into that industry as well. Some won't, but the majority will, because they know how difficult it was for them. With that, actually, before we get onto we've got some tough questions coming in, by the way, so I hope you guys are ready for this. Before we do, maybe James and Adi, if you tell us how you two got into the industry. How did you get into where you are now? What did you do?
Yeah, sure. I can start. I'll be quite brief, but I entered the industry through the internship program that Heather referenced. So I was an intern 2 years ago. I guess what kind of helped me in getting that internship was just really being interested in music and always being proactive and trying to get experience within music, even if that was kind of in obscure ways. So I studied business studies at university, not necessarily the most related you would think, but actually there's loads of opportunities to insert music into your academics as well. So when I was kind of studying at university, I always tried to kind of lean into any case studies that were related to music or kind of had music implications. So because of those kind of things, I was always kind of thinking about music and using some of the skills that you might not always think are applicable to music, but actually really honing in on those skills. So whether it's things like, you know, business or strategy or economics or maths, all of these skills, or even English or philosophy, there's so many different skills that you can actually flex, and they can actually help you when you think about it in a way to apply to music. So that's really quickly what I did. I went to uni, was doing loads of different bits and bobs, made sure I was kind of focused on music from an academics perspective as well, in terms of inserting it and incorporating it into my work. And then I kind of entered through the internship program.
James, what about you? How did you get into Sony?
Yeah, I was probably many years before Ardit, but I also came in through the internship program. But whereas Ardit came into the Insight team straight away through his internship, I actually started in a role in the HR intern. So I was working in human resources within Sony, and that was my first kind of role. And I think there's a kind of lesson there in that it wasn't necessarily the exact area I knew loads about, but I knew that I kind of wanted to work in music, and I was lucky enough to secure that role. And then honestly, once I was in that position, I just tried to make the most of understanding how the business works from the inside. So kind of worked around that internship with lots of different departments, and I kind of identified the Insight team at that point as something that was maybe where I could see my future within the company, and maybe where I could add the most value. And at that point, I was actually still at university when I was doing that internship, so I had a kind of a gap year within my studies to do the internship. And I essentially just kind of said to the person that was heading up the Insight team at that point, I've got a year where I'm going to be doing a dissertation. I don't necessarily know what it's going to be on yet, but how can we brainstorm some challenges that you might want someone like me to focus on for a year that your team don't necessarily have the time to do? So it actually really gave me a lot of purpose when I was finishing my degree, to both kind of be working on a challenge in an industry that I was interested in, but one that I actually was able to come back into Sony at the end of my degree as well, and say that here's what I found over the course of kind of doing that dissertation. And I think, maybe off the back of that, it was good timing as well. There just happened to be a role within the Insight team as well that was kind of coming up on the horizon, and I was lucky enough, I think probably because I'd sort of been proactive, to be sort of one of the first in line when they were considering who they might be able to bring into that team.
That's good. And it's interesting to see that you went from the exotic and exciting role and team of HR over to the slightly more calm and boring Insight section. For those students that don't know about HR, I worked in HR for years. It's the necessary jobs that are done that can be exciting, but there's HR is a great area to work in because it encompasses so much. And I think one of the things that we want students to understand is that companies that you look at, that you think, okay, this company does that product, don't just do that one thing, and they don't just have jobs in that one sector. So like I said earlier about Sony Music, they don't just have jobs that are about music. When you start to break down these big companies, they will have an HR department, because it is important to make sure that people are looked after in the department, to make sure that they're paid, to make sure that they know what their benefits are, but also to make sure that you've got an IT department that fixes everybody's computers and make sure they have all the right software. But then there are finance departments to make sure that the company makes money and that everybody can get paid. So there's a lot of different areas within a company. So like even looking at something like Sony Music, there are so many different sectors that you could be involved in by being part of that company, and you'll still be part of that culture. We talk about that a lot when we talk about when you go to choose your university, or you go to choose your company that you're going to apply to and work for, look at their culture and their values. So Sony Music has culture and values, and those will be the same whether you work in their finance, HR, Insight department, or even what Ardit and James said earlier about discovering new talent. So there are those opportunities that open up. And once you get into a company, there are other opportunities that will always open up to you as you go through life as well, because life is a journey that changes. And you heard that James, he went into HR and has now gone into Insight. There is one question about what you guys studied at university. I know, Ardit, you said you studied business studies. James, what did you study at university?
So I think really just coincidentally, I studied business as well. But that's not necessarily the only path by a long stretch into the kind of Insight team. So my boss, for example, is really great at English literature, for example. So he's a kind of real kind of English lit sort of fan, and he was really great at that. And that allows him to, although a lot of our work in the Insight team is to do with kind of numbers and running surveys and that kind of thing. So we have to have some of those kind of math skills. I think obviously he's kind of taken a different approach, and he's fantastic at kind of writing everything that we kind of write to bring our audiences to life. So if you look at the segment profiles that we shared as part of the pre-task, he's the person that kind of writes all of those different segment profiles, for example. So I think there's lots of different skills and lots of different angles and ways in. I think it's just about, honestly asking the people in those roles, what kind of things, what does your day-to-day look like? What are the sort of things that you'll be doing? And I think there's lots of different angles that you can take to say, here's how I personally could add value to your team. Here's what I'm really good at, or here's what I really enjoy doing, and here's how it could sort of help elevate what that part of the company does.
That's really good information. That's really good stuff to relay back to our students as well. And think about what James has just said there as well. Those skills that you learn at school and those things that you are good at, you bring those strengths to a company, and they can be used for so many different things. And like say, the same people in the same team will have different strengths, and they're used for different things. You can't have everybody in a team you can't have everybody that's all good at the same thing. Otherwise, nothing goes forward. Just for the teachers, I'm about to put a link, I am putting a link in the chat box now to a Typeform. It's a little survey about today's session. If you can share that with your students now or after the lesson and get them to fill out as soon as possible, that would be great. We've got like 4 minutes left, and we've got a couple of questions. Do you find that artists you sign for one single have an easier fan base to engage than artists you sign for multiple albums, or vice versa? Go on, Ardit.
I think the challenges I think is a really good question. I think the challenges are unique to both of those propositions, and I wouldn't say one is easier than the other. I just think they're totally different questions. I think if we're signing an artist for a song, then you can imagine that the objectives is really about making that song as big as possible, and really amplifying that song and thinking about cool ways that we can do that. If we're working with an artist that we think, we're going to be working with for albums and albums, then it's really for us to maybe do a bit more work in the kind of developing stages, when that artist might not even really be recognized and might not actually have a lot of followers or have a lot of music out. It's for us to firstly, develop them and help them grow as people and as musicians, but also to understand, how we can market them, what kind of artist positioning they can have, so understanding where they fit in compared to some of their peers. So it's two different questions, but it's a really, really good question, because we do have both. We do have artists that we work on that we're working for a long time, like Tom Walker, which James mentioned earlier, who we've been working on for years. And then we'll also have some artists that we're working on just for a song, but also, it's a totally different ask, and we'll have different methodologies and strategies to help with that as well.
Interesting. We've got another question, tough one. I don't know if either of you two are going to be able to answer this, but if you are, I'll give you kudos. Why do record labels take such a large cut? Discuss. Do they even take a large cut?
I think honestly that it does, again, vary artist to artist, and all of the sort of deals we make with artists are very different, as we've kind of touched on there. I think, in some instances we work with artists well before anyone might have even heard of them. So, someone from our I&R team might sign an artist, and it might be years and years, 3 or 4 years before they're even ready to release music. And Sony sort of supports them over that time, understanding who they want to be as an artist, helping them kind of develop their songwriting, helping them sort of develop their kind of outlook on the world. And even that can vary in terms of what that looks like. It might be connecting them with different producers. For some of our artists, it's honestly been doing things like, saying that I think you just need to go and kind of live life for a little bit to inform your songwriting. So here's a train ticket to travel across Europe for 6 months. Go and do that, and kind of, develop your unique outlook on the world, and then come back to us and let us know what you've written. So there's all of those different kind of ways that Sony would support an artist in their development. And then obviously when we're kind of working with an artist to amplify their music, we're investing, a lot of kind of brains and energy, but also a lot financially in terms of helping to market that artist as well. So whether that's kind of bringing in brand partners, as we touched on, whether that's kind of marketing them through lots of different channels, hopefully to build the right audience for that artist communicate their vision at the heart of it. But I think most of the artists that work with Sony or kind of any label are doing so generally, and I think this is positive on their terms, but working with a label in the way that's right for them to kind of develop their careers in the right way. So on that front, I think it's a bit of a nuanced one, because we don't necessarily have a one size fits all for any artist we work with.
That's good to hear. And also, I think you got to understand, for those of you that would want to join Sony Music later on, your wages have got to be paid somehow, so the money comes from somewhere. But I know that we've got like 1 minute left, and so a lot of students are going to be having to move to a different lesson. I do want to say thank you to Ardit and James for coming along, taking the time to put the presentation together and to give the presentation as well, and for just engaging with the students and getting the pre-work sent out as well. I think it was brilliant. I still have no idea who Heady One is or whatever, but I'm going to go and research that now, because I didn't actually realize it was an artist. I'm going to go and do some research. But it's been great. I think it's been fantastic, the information that you guys have brought, but also the students and the teachers that have helped have those interactions has been pretty fantastic as well. Give yourselves all a pat on the back, because I know it's not the easiest thing to do on a, what is it, Thursday afternoon. So yeah, but thank you for all of the interactions, and thank you for all of the questions that have come through. If there's any other questions that you've got that you might want me to pass on to Sony later on, or even if you want help from me about any things that we've got going on, email me at student@pathwayctm.com. That form that I've also sent out earlier, you can fill that in and it will get you back to me straight away. But I'm just going to put my email address in the box. So that's student@pathwayctm.com. If you want any help understanding about how to get to Sony Music or anything else with your career, or you want me to pass anything over to them, email me at student@pathwayctm.com. Thank you very much, guys. Thank you for coming along. I hope you all enjoyed that.
Amazing. Thank you.
Thank you for everyone for spending the hour with us.
No worries. No worries. I'm sure they've all enjoyed it. I am going to stop the recording as well now. Just do that.